morning. Let's start with today's lecture. So today we're going to look at constructions of indistinguishable encryption schemes. Let me first briefly recall what we did last time. So first of all, we defined our refined notion of security, namely via the indistinguishability game. And so where the adversary outputs two messages, gets the encryption of a random one of these two, and then has to decide which of the two messages was encrypted. Okay, we always will have that the two messages have to be of the same length. We cannot hide the length of messages using encryption. So this is important because this indistinguishability notion will be part of all security notions for encryption schemes. So indistinguishability we will never deviate from. We will add to it, giving the adversary more power. So and then we had the usual stuff. We had looked at it as this game and this graphical representation of it. And then we had that we have this eavesdropping advantage we define as the difference in absolute value of the probability for an adversary to output 1 minus 1/2 because we always can win the game with basically probability 1/2. We also argued, and I'll do that in more detail in the lecture notes, that we can safely ignore the absolute values, which makes proofs sometimes easier. Sometimes it doesn't matter, but sometimes it makes them easier. And then we had our definition, which says that a private key encryption scheme has indistinguishable encryptions against eavesdropping attacks, or is simply eavesdropping secure if for every probabilistic polynomial time adversary there is a negligible function such that this eavesdropping advantage is negligible. This part here, from here on, with something else replaced here, is basically the last sentence of every security definition that I make in this course. For every probabilistic polynomial time adversary, there is a negligible function such that something holds. Okay, so easy to remember. And here, no adversary can distinguish between the two messages that he picked himself. So he cannot win this game except with probability roughly 1/2 plus this negligible term. The difference to perfect secrecy was that we looked at probabilistic polynomial time adversaries only, not all adversaries. And in perfect secrecy, we had here a 0. Here we allow negligible functions, functions that are really, really small, but not necessarily 0. Okay? So this was what we had here. And as a, so remember this indistinguishability, that's important. And then we saw that this notion implies more intuitive notions. For example, this notion here that given encryption of a random plain text, you cannot even predict the first bit of this message, except with probability 1/2 roughly. That it's here the first bit doesn't really matter any bit, basically. You cannot predict any or guess any bit of the message. So this indistinguishability is really also implies many other more intuitive notions, maybe. And then most importantly, we saw the first proof technique, our standard proof technique in this example. And we do this using reductions. Okay? And what we did is reduction shows that if we have an algorithm that wins this prediction game with more or has a larger than negligible advantage in this prediction game, we can actually define a new adversary that has a larger than negligible advantage in the eavesdropping game. So we can construct an algorithm that distinguishes ciphertexts. And then in the proof outline, and that is roughly the outline for all security proofs that I do, is from this A prime, which is arbitrary but fixed, we construct this A. We show that if A prime is PPT, then A is PPT. Why PPT? Because in our security definition instance, we only look at probabilistic polynomial time algorithms. Right? And we need to do something for all PPTs. And then we define these functions, which basically are the advantages of the two adversaries. And then we relate those two advantages. In fact, we can show that we relate them in such a way that if delta is negligible, then epsilon is negligible. Delta being the advantage of this new PPT against pi. Okay. And then, because we know that this, by assumption, this pi is eavesdropping secure, we know that this must be negligible, hence this must be negligible, and hence we have that for any PPT algorithm A prime, its advantage here is negligible. And that's it. And this is the outline of all proofs. Then we filled in the details for our concrete example. And that was it. This is important. This slide you should really understand. And really understand why this is the right thing to do. Okay. Good. Then we looked at this construction, but never mind. We also looked at this in a schematic view, how we constructed A from A prime. And the important thing is that this A uses this A prime then as a subroutine in a very specific way. And the pictures will always be like, this is a large A that I construct, and it can use this A prime as a subroutine. That's why I put the box inside of the larger box. Okay, and that's it. I don't want to go to the details anymore. So, good. So far, so good. So once we have this definition of indistinguishable encryptions, we obviously want to be able to construct such schemes, right? Otherwise, this would be a pretty useless exercise. So we want to construct eavesdropping secure encryption schemes. And as I said in the very introduction to the course, I want to do constructions that are based on very general assumptions. Right? Assuming some objects of a certain type exist, I want to be able to construct from these eavesdropping secure encryption schemes. Right? And the thing that I, for the beginning, will assume exist are so-called pseudorandom generators. Then I will briefly talk about how can we get pseudorandom generators by doing even more basic assumptions. But for the time being, we'll work with pseudorandom generators. And this is, again, one of the most important concepts in cryptography is the pseudorandomness. What I will do is I will construct an encryption scheme that looks like the one-time pad, but doesn't use truly random bit strings. Instead, I replace them by things that are pseudorandom. And the objects that create these things, these pseudorandom bit strings, are pseudorandom generators. And if I say something is pseudorandom, it always means the same. It says it looks like something that's random to any probabilistic polynomial time algorithm, but in fact is not random. But it's indistinguishable from something that's truly random for any probabilistic polynomial time algorithm. Okay, so how do we make this more precise? Here is the formal definition. So let L be a function such that L of n is larger than n for any n in n. It's a length function. Okay? And we call a deterministic polynomial time algorithm a pseudorandom generator, or PRG, with expansion factor L of m if for all s in 0, 1 star, G will produce also a bit string. And by the absolute values, I then denote the length of the bit strings, number of bits in it. So the length of the output of G on input S is at least L of the length of S itself. Okay? So which means that if I feed an input of length n into G, I get something out of length L of n. Okay, and since I have this is longer than n. Yeah? So that's why it's called the expansion factor, or the expansion term. Okay? So this is the length restrictions. But more importantly is the following part. It's the indistinguishability part, which says that for every probabilistic polynomial time algorithm D, there is a negligible function mu. You should recall this term such that for all n, the following is true. If I feed D with a truly random bit string, you picked uniformly at random of length L of n, the probability that it outputs 1 minus the probability that if I feed it a bit string of the form G of S, where S is from 0, 1, n, and then I look at this probability of outputting 1, this is the difference between the two things is negligible. Okay? And it also gets this 1 to the n as input, but that's the security parameter, but that's just for technical reasons, just to make the semantics and syntax correct. Okay? So what this means is that, and recall that if S is from 0, 1 to the n, G of n has length L of n as well. Okay? So this means that its behavior of D when it gets a truly random bit string of length L of n is almost the same as if it gets something of the form G of S. Huh? Okay.
Why is L of n greater than n here? Do we get a longer bit string?
Yeah, we want to stretch. So this here means, so S, later on, what here, we pick this S, which is kind of, think of L of n being much longer than n. So we get something that's truly random, short, and expand it to this G of S, which is much longer. But this says that you cannot distinguish where you are living. Okay? Let's do a concrete example with some numbers. So assume that L of n, say, is 2n. Okay? Then let me say that G of 0, 1 to the n, this is a set. I denote by this simply the set of all r in 0, 1 to n such that there exists an S such that r is equal to G of S. Yeah? I look at the images of G under bit strings of length S. Okay? Then, so now we can look at these two sets, 0, 1 to the 2, and that this would be, in our example, this is this set here, right? Well, you all know that this is of size 2 to the n. Right? Now, what about the size of this set here? Well, this set here can be at most of size 2 to the n, right? Because I have only 2 to the n pre-images. And it's at most because 2 pre-images could map to the same image. So it could be less than 2 to the n. Right? Huh? Because, oh, I say, something important was missing here. Okay, s into 0, 1 to the n. Okay. Now, if you look at this set here, let's denote it by just this big box here. Right? So this is, okay. Now, obviously, if you compare 2 to the n to 2 to the 2n, this is 1 over 2 to the n. So this thing here is much, much larger than this thing here. So this here is really just this tiny little set in here somewhere. Well, actually, it's not like a contiguous set. It's like points all over the place. But let me just draw it this way. Right? I just collect them in such a way. So this is G of, okay? Now, this definition here says, for every probabilistic polynomial time algorithm, whether I give it something uniformly picked from this set here or picked from this set here, it behaves almost identical. Okay? Which seems like something that's almost impossible because this is so tiny compared to this. How could something behave on this tiny set similar to what we have on the large set? But as we'll see, these things, we assume that they exist. We have good reasons to believe that these things exist. Okay? Yeah. So what I often also say is that this G induces a distribution on this set here. It induces one by picking S uniformly at random, then apply G of S. Okay, so this is what we have here. Okay, so often what we can see is that this D lives in two different worlds, right? One world is this guy here, picking things uniformly at random. The other world is this here. And this says every PPT must behave similarly in the two worlds. Okay. At this point, I will not tell you how to construct pseudorandom generators. Let's just assume they do exist, where later on I will briefly argue that these things exist if so-called one-way functions exist. But never mind. But to get used to this definition, I will give you an example of what is not a pseudorandom generator. Because that I'll do by then, how do I prove that something is not a pseudorandom generator? Well, I give you a specific PPT-D that violates this condition, for which this difference is significant. Okay, and then you may see that it's really sometimes difficult but that is really difficult to construct these things. Okay. Okay. So, okay, let's go to this. Any questions so far? Okay. But remember, this is just an example, but typically, we want even things to be larger than 2 of n. In this case, this becomes even a smaller and smaller fraction of this thing. Okay. Okay, so let's do example of not PRG. And I do something very simple, even simpler than what I did before. L of n is n plus 1. Okay, I just want to stretch or expand by 1 bit. Okay. So here is G. It's an algorithm. Well, actually, I'll define it. Okay, yeah, let's define it as a deterministic algorithm. Okay, deterministic. That it doesn't use any internal randomness. It must be deterministic. G on input S, which is S up to Sn in 0, 1 to the n. And the SIs are then bits. Okay? Okay. How do we do that? Output compute S prime, or let's compute Sn plus 1 as the XOR of the bits in S. XOR of all of them. And then output R, which is S1 up to Sn, and then I just concatenate it with Sn plus 1. So this is just S, the double bars is concatenation, Sn plus 1. Huh?
What have you written at the end of the second line? Like after Sn belongs to
Here?
Yeah,
Si. The SIs are the individual bits of S. Okay? And I claim that this is not a PRG. This is way too simple. How can we see that this is not a PRG? So it's not a PRG. Well, I give you a distinguisher D. Yeah? Now comes the important part to understand what this definition means. The algorithm D that I give you works on inputs of a certain length, just defined on inputs of certain length, period. Not something, well, if I get something of this form or this form, it just works on, gets an input of length, in our case, n plus 1 something, and then it does something. It outputs 1 or 0. I always assume that the other output is only 0. Its output's always 1 or 0. So D on input 1 to the n. Now it's quite convenient that I have this 1 to the n in here, and then I say, and R, in this case, of length n plus 1, right? Because this is what it does with if this security parameter is n, then now we are talking about L of n, n plus 1. Well, it does the following, and R is of the form R is R1, Rn, and Rn plus 1. And again, these are the bits of R, right? And what I do is compute Rn plus 1 prime as the XOR of the first n bits. Huh? And then output 1 if Rn plus 1 prime is equal to Rn plus 1. Otherwise, I output 0. Huh? The algorithm just checks whether the last bit is the XOR of the first n bits. So that's a distinguisher. Just gets inputs of the 1n and then the right length, and then it just looks at these inputs, and based on some computations it does, it outputs 0 or 1. Yeah? Nothing involving, well, if I get something of this form or this form, because that is not, it's supposed to distinguish between these two things, not based on some prior knowledge. Yeah? Okay? And now we have to look at these two probabilities, right? What does it do if it gets inputs always of this form, or it gets inputs that are generated like this? The probability here, these two probabilities here, D is deterministic. The probabilities here are only over the random choices here or here. That's the only randomness involved in here because D is deterministic. There is no internal randomness. Okay? Now you can, let's start with the easy one. What's the probability that D, as I defined it here, on input 1 to the n and G of S outputs 1, and often we'll write then this here, G. This is sometimes, I write it below this PR if I want to denote the random choices here. What is this? Yeah? Yes, why?
Because we always can decide if it's computed by the function g.
You do not have to decide whether it's computed by the function g.
Basically, if we input a number from g, we always have the right output, and
Yeah.
then the probability is 1.
Yeah. If you get something that was generated as g of s, then by definition of g, this is always true. Right? That's the way g was defined. So this is 1. Okay? It's the way g is defined. Right? Now let's do the other probability. Now here, I don't have space to do this, but R is chosen uniformly at random from 0, 1 to the n plus 1. What's the probability of outputting 1 over this random choice? Yeah?
1/2.
Correct. Why?
Because half of the inputs in 0, 1 to the n plus 1 have the right parity, and the others don't have.
Exactly. If you give me a random bit string, the first n bits I fix already, then the parity is fixed, right? Or this here. But then I pick the last one uniformly at random, and it's the same as the parity with probability 1/2. It's a random bit. So this is 1/2. So this difference here is 1/2, and that's not negligible. It's a constant. But that's the way we have to look at these distinguishers. That's why this is important. It just works on these bit strings and does something based on the form of the bit strings. Yeah? Okay. If the second remark I want to make, because it also explains something about this definition, is here we need to restrict ourselves to PPT algorithms. if we look at arbitrary algorithms that may run in exponential time, this is impossible to achieve. Okay. Not based on any assumptions or whatever, it's just plain impossible. So probabilistic polynomial time distinguishes the restriction to those is here is important. It's necessary. Okay. Can I remove this?
Could you explain once again how you got 1 for the first
For this here,
yeah.
if I give you an input of this form, it was created in this way. The last bit is the XOR or the parity of the first. Well, that's exactly what I check here. So it always has this property. I only output bits of this form. So that's why it's 1. It's always true. For all S's. So since these probabilities are only over the choice of the S's, I have to compute the ratio of the S's for which this guy outputs 1 as opposed to all inputs. And for all it does the right thing. Okay. Good. Can I remove this? It's in the lecture notes anyway, I think. Okay, so why only PPT-D? I give you now a distinguisher, a D, that has always a large distance between, or a large difference for any G. But it's not polynomial time. It's exponential time. But it can achieve something that's large here. Okay? So G fixed. And then we do D on with expansion factor L. Okay. D on input. So D on input, D always expects on input 1 to the n, and now it expects some element from of length L of n, right? D on input 1 to the n and R in 0, 1 to the L of n. Okay? And what it does is for all s in 0, 1 to the n, check whether g of s is equal to r. I try all of them, all s. If one such s exists, output 1, otherwise output 0. Okay? I try all pre-images, see whether they fit. Okay. D is not a PPT. It has to check all s in 0, 1 to the n. So this takes time at least 2 to the n. Right? For each s, you have to do something. so not PPT. But it does have a good difference here. Okay. Why is that? Well, we can again analyze the probability if I pick S. Let's say I want to do this in this way. Yeah, why not? What's the probability that D on input 1 to the S and G of S outputs 1? What's this probability? If I give it one of the form G of S. Yeah?
It's 1.
Yeah, why?
Because it tries all S in U 1 to the N, eventually it will find.
Yeah, it tries all of them. Eventually it will hit this one. And it finds it, right? Okay. Now what's the probability for R uniformly at random? L of n. Probability that D on 1 to the n R outputs 1. What's this probability? Give you a hint. It's an upper bound. Yeah?
It's the magnitude of the set that can be provided from G
Yeah.
Divided by 2 to the power of L of n.
Yeah. So for which, how many, what is a set for which it, let's do it equality here, it outputs 1 exactly for these elements of G of 0, 1 to the n. Right? So it's really exactly on these things it outputs 1, exactly on these, divided, now because I have the probability, divided by the set, the size of the set I have here. As we discussed previously, this has size at most 2 to the n. This has size 2 to the L of n. Right? And since L of n is at least n plus 1, this is upper bounded by 1/2. In general, it's much smaller. But then the difference between the two, this guy here is at least 1/2. Okay? So this notion here doesn't make sense without restricting ourselves here to PPT algorithms. We need that. Otherwise, it's a vacuous definition. Okay. So that's a point. No D that is not allowed to spend a lot of time, only polynomial time can distinguish or can see what's going on. Okay? I think in the exercises we will look at a equivalent but an alternative but equivalent definition where you actually have to decide in which of the two worlds you are living. Right? It's equivalent, but this one turned, for technical reasons, this is kind of nicer. Yeah? Okay, you will also see examples, other examples of G's that don't work. Anything that you could imagine doesn't work, probably. Okay. So to make our notation consistent, I also give this difference for every D. I give it a name. It's a distinguishing advantage or simply advantage of D against G. So the definition, this one then simply requires for all PPTs D, the distinguishing advantage is negligible. In N. Negligibility always involves functions, so you have to always look at sequences of N. Okay, yeah? So just to say one thing about the construction of CRGs, we can show that these things exist if one-way functions exist. If and only if one-way functions. And I will define one-way functions later. But the construction from one-way functions to PRG is kind of, if you want, it's really extremely clever and nice, but I won't talk about this in this course. You have to define hardcore predicates, and then you do something with expansion n+1 and stuff. Let's not talk about this. Okay. So instead, I want to use PRGs to construct eavesdropping secure encryption schemes. The idea is very simple. What this here says is these strings generated by G are almost as good as random strings. So take the one-time pad and replace the random string by a pseudorandom string. That's it. And the S is the key. And then we prove that this works. So here is the construction of an encryption scheme from such a function G. And I can, the syntactic definition simply takes a function G or an algorithm G that has this length restriction, that it stretches. And then the security will be based on the fact that that we assume that it's a PRG. That also satisfies the second part of our definition. So let L be a function, L of n being larger than n for all n, and let G be a deterministic algorithm such that for all s in 0, 1 prime, the length of G of s is L of s, or length of s. And then we define the fixed length encryption scheme. Remember, fixed length encryption scheme is an encryption scheme that on security parameter n can only encrypt messages of a certain length. In our case, it will be L of n. Yeah? So it's a fixed length. We define the fixed length encryption scheme pi g with message length L of n by doing the following. G on input 1 to the n chooses the key k uniformly and at random. And then on input a key k in 0, 1 to the n and a message m in 0, 1 to the L of n. It's fixed length message, fixed length encryption scheme. Output the ciphertext C as m XOR G of k. XOR bitwise XOR. This makes sense because this is of length L of n. This has this property, so this guy is also of length L of n, so we can XOR bitwise. And on input a key k and a ciphertext C in 0, 1 to the L of n, we do the reverse operation. Do, again, the same thing. So the key in this encryption scheme is simply the seed for the pseudo for G. The S's here, these are usually called seeds. So this is a one-time pad where I replace the truly random bit string here by a pseudo-random bit string. Yeah. Good. Clear? The security of this scheme is one sentence, actually. It's the intuition for this is one sentence. If G is a pseudo-random generator, these things look like random bit strings to any polynomial time adversary. But if we use a random bit string here, we have the one-time pad. And we know that the one-time pad has indistinguishable encryptions. So this one should have one indistinguishable encryptions. The difference should be tiny. There should be a difference because it's just pseudorandom, but the difference should be related to this difference between the pseudorandom stuff and the truly random stuff. And that's exactly what we do. That's exactly how we prove this stuff. Yeah? But this is the idea. And this is really an idea that you should keep in mind. This is something that we often do. We know that something is secure if we use something that's truly random. Replaces truly random stuff by something that's pseudorandom, indistinguishable to random. And that should work. If our definition of pseudorandomness makes any sense, that must work. Okay? Okay. This is one of the things where then when you look at research papers, they really often handle these things by one sentence. Why is this secure? Well, if we replace this stuff by random, it's secure clearly. It's pseudorandom, it must be secure, period. And that was even 2 sentences. They do it even shorter. Right? Okay, so what we want to prove is this theorem 2.10, which says if G is a pseudorandom generator, it has also the second property, then pi G, as in construction 2.9, has indistinguishable encryptions. This doesn't work. I knew this. Anyway, so it has indistinguishable against eavesdropping attacks. Okay. And we want to prove this. Okay. Okay. And so how am I going to prove this? Well, we use our blueprint. Slightly now adjusted to the current situation. So given any A that succeeds or that we have as something that distinguishes between encryptions. Given that A, we construct a distinguisher D for the algorithm G. We show that if A is a PPT, then D is a PPT. We define delta as the distinguishing advantage of D. We define epsilon to be the success of the advantage of A, the adversary against our pi G. We show that if delta is negligible, then epsilon is negligible. We relate them in such a way. And then we know since we have a pseudorandom generator, we know that delta is negligible, hence epsilon must be negligible. Since A was arbitrary, we are done. Okay? So this will now be, I will call it A, the other will be D. A prime will be an A against the encryption scheme pi G. A will be the distinguisher against G, and the rest is just as before. Okay? The interesting part obviously will be in defining D based on A, and then this stuff here relating these two things. This is often quite simple. Okay? Yeah? So let's do this. proof let A be a fixed but arbitrary adversary against pi g. We said epsilon n is the private, the eavesdropping private key advantage of A against pi g. No, sorry. Anyway. Which is the eavesdropping advantage of A against pi g, right? I hope sorry. Just the notation is a little bit confusing. Where's my? Yeah. Sorry. It's A pi g, just to make sure that I get the okay. Then we now define our D. Okay? Here we go. So now we have to convert this, just changing a little bit this A here. Now we have to convert this eavesdropper into a distinguisher. Eavesdropper against pi g into a distinguisher against g. Okay? And what it does is the following: d on input 1 to the n and 0, 1 to the L of n. Well, that's how the input looks for a distinguisher. It just gets a security parameter and it gets a bit string of a certain length, namely L of n. Yeah. What it does, in the first step, it simulates, it runs A on input 1 to the n to obtain two messages M0, M1 from 0, 1 to the L of n. Then D chooses B, 0, 1 and sets C to be W, X, or MB. Okay? So it encrypts sort of this MB with W, using this W. Yeah? It simulates A with input 1 to the n and C to obtain a bit B prime, and if B is equal to B prime, it outputs 1. If it's not equal, it outputs 0. Okay? So as usual, if we do that, this D here now plays the role of the challenger for A as well. And that's clearer if, oops, sorry. Yeah. Why don't I have the picture in here? Okay, anyway. Good. Okay. So, clear? What this guy does? Now, first of all, if A is a probabilistic polynomial time algorithm, then D is a probabilistic polynomial time algorithm as well. What is it doing? It simulates A here, so that's the running time of A. It has to compute one XOR. It's okay. It simulates A again, polynomial time, and then it just compares two bits. You know how to do that. So it's a PPT. Yeah? Now, what is the distinguishing advantage? So what we then claim is that the distinguishing advantage of D against G is exactly the eavesdropping advantage of IA against pi G. Okay. Okay. Let's do that. Why is that? Okay, so we know that the distinguishing advantage of D against G on input N is the difference in these two probabilities, right? The probability, and just let me, because here I don't really care about the absolute values. So let me write this here. This is the probability over the random choice of S that D on input 1 to the N and G of S outputs 1 minus the probability over the choice of R that D 1 to the N R outputs 1. Right? This was our definition. Okay. Now let's look at this case here. Yeah? Okay. In this case here, what we get here is a random, is something that is generated picking S uniformly at random and then applying G. Yeah? In this case here then we have W is of the form G of S, and S is picked uniformly at random from 0 to the N, right? That's in that world, this is how W is generated and given to D. Okay? But that's exactly the key generation in pi G, right? So in that case, this here is a key. Or is this G of S where S is the key, right? Okay. So in this scenario, in this world, what A gets here is really an encryption of a message MB of its choice, as in the indistinguishability game. Right? It plays against really the encryption scheme pi G in the indistinguishability game. Okay? So this really is, just by looking at it, this really is the probability that I have here. Sorry, I should probably have written here probably that this is 1, right? In front of it. Sometimes I forget my own notation, actually. I should have written here. Yeah, I should have written here the probability in front, right? So this is really the probability that this is 1. Okay, sorry. Let me just replace this. So this is really the probability Okay? So this is this part here. Okay? So in this world, we have analyzed this. Now we look at this world here. In this world here, we get R uniformly at random of length L of n. Then what we get here, really in this game here, then W is uniformly at random. Right? What A gets here in this game is an encryption under the one-time pad. We know that its advantage in the eavesdropping game, so it really plays the eavesdropping game against the one-time pad. We know what the advantage in the eavesdropping game against the one-time pad is, or what the probability of winning it is. It's 1/2. Yeah. So this really is the probability of winning in this game of A against the one-time pad, N. Okay? And this is 1/2, as we know. Yeah? Okay? So this is this guy here. This is 1/2. This is the eavesdropping advantage. Yeah? So this here really is epsilon n. Again, the two things are the same. This would our delta n, and this is epsilon n. Now we can argue we have a pseudorandom generator. Delta n is negligible, hence epsilon n is negligible. Since A was fixed but arbitrary, we have shown that for all PPTAs, this eavesdropping advantage is negligible. And we are done. Okay? And going back to my intuition, that's exactly what I said, right? I replace it by truly randomness. Then I know that it's secure. Then the original one must also be secure. So that uses the pseudo-randomness. Just to warn you, this is not always going to be the same in the future. There will be differences, but differences in such a way that I still can argue that if this is negligible, then this is negligible as well. This may be twice this, doesn't matter because 2 times negligible is still negligible. It may be a polynomial times this thing, polynomial times negligible is still negligible. Then we have our rules for the negligible function that we can apply. Okay. Okay. So far, so good. And remember, this is important, replacing, if you have something that's secure, if you use something that's random, you may safely replace this by something that's pseudorandom. and you still get something that's secure, according to some definition. It doesn't really matter which definition that is. Okay. Now we come to, so this is, with these pseudorandom generators, we can generate encryption schemes for fixed length messages, which is not what we usually want. Usually we want to be able to encrypt arbitrary messages without increasing the key length. Right? Of course, you can use this scheme here by encrypting longer and longer messages, but then you have to use longer and longer keys, which, as I said, is one of the disadvantages of the one-time pad. We don't want that. We want one fixed key length that determines the security, and then we should be able to encrypt arbitrarily long messages. Okay. How can we do that? So the easiest case would be, well, if I have such a scheme, as this one here, that can encrypt messages of a certain length. I have a message that's much longer. I partition it into blocks of the right length. Partition it into blocks of length L of n, and then apply the encryption scheme with the same key to each block individually. We'll see this later. That's the so-called ECB mode. Okay. But our definition of security here with the game, I would like this here, it's a one-shot game. The adversary once picks two messages, gets the encryption of one of them, and then has to decide. He just gets the encryption of one message. Okay? Now, if you look at this, what I just said, partition it to blocks and do each block individually, you get more than the encryption of one message. Well, you could, as an adversary, say, look, I picked two blocks. To pick a message that is of the length of two of these blocks. And then I can pick for each individual block, I can pick my message, and then I get the encryption of one of them. And I can do sort of pick two messages, each consisting of two blocks. So I get at least then when I get this here, I get the encryption of two of my messages. This definition doesn't cover this, because here the key is just used once. This is one of the big disadvantages of this definition. It's eavesdropping and just one. You eavesdrop on one message. So our first enhancement and strengthening of this definition is to include this scenario where the adversary can get the encryption of more messages and then has to decide, or yes, can have two sequences of messages. One of the sequence is encrypted. The message is in one of the sequences is encrypted. He gets all the encryptions and then has to decide which sequence it was. So this is the multiple messages eavesdropping game. And this is defined as follows. Again, the indistinguishability part stays the same. We want to distinguish, but we give the adversary more power. Namely, here on common input 1 to the n, as before, the challenger chooses the key for the encryption scheme. Then A now outputs two messages, capital M0 and capital M1, of messages of his choice. where at each position, the messages have the same length. This even applies to variable length encryption schemes. But at each position, the messages have to be the same. If it's a fixed length encryption scheme, then they will always be of the one length for the encryption scheme. Right? Then, as before, C chooses a bit B, and then using its key, it encrypts either all messages in this sequence or all messages in this sequence, and gives the complete sequence of ciphertext back to the adversary. Huh? And then the adversary outputs a bit B prime, and the result of the game is 1 if B is equal to B prime, and otherwise it's 0. Yeah? And then we do our usual machinery. We write this for the output of the game on input 1 to the end. It's a binary random variable. And it denotes this probability that the success probability. And then we call the eavesdropping advantage. We subtract 1/2. Again, 1/2 because it's only a bit. It's 2 sequences. And then we say that it's secure, has indistinguishable multiple encryptions against eavesdropping attacks if for every PBT algorithm A there is a negligible function such that and so on, right? The usual stuff. Okay. Now comes a disappointing message. There exist private key encryption schemes that have indistinguishable encryptions, but not indistinguishable multiple encryptions. Which doesn't say anything against the encryption schemes. It just says that our original definition of security, or our second definition, namely, the first one was perfect secrecy. That was not good. Indistinguishable encryptions, also not so good, because we want these multiple encryptions. You don't want to use a key just once. You want to use it several times. You need this. And indistinguishable encryptions doesn't guarantee it alone. So that's the bad news. Okay. I wipe the board, clean the board, and you think about the encryption scheme that proves this. You don't have too many choices, right? Because you don't know too many encryption schemes, so it should be easy to come up with one. So what's the example? Yeah?
The one-time pad.
Exactly. The one-time pad is the only one where we actually unconditionally know that it has indistinguishable encryptions, right? So consider the one-time pad. So how would you, we know that it has indistinguishable encryptions, right? So it has indistinguishable encryptions, but not indistinguishable multiple encryptions. Why? Can you give me an example?
So yeah, we construct two message blocks.
Yeah.
Two messages with two blocks.
Yeah.
That then encrypt by C.
Yeah.
And then we can obtain the key from the message.
Yeah.
And if the encrypted message of one block with the key is the same for this block. We can determine if it's bit 1 or bit
Yeah.
0.
Yeah, if you give me 2 messages, I can even recover the key.
Yeah.
Do it even simpler. It's a right idea, it's a good idea. I want it to be even simpler because then I can generalize the idea. What would you do? I really want you to construct sequences of messages where given the ciphertext, you can easily decide which of the 2 sequences was encrypted. Yeah.
Use one block which has the same message, and the other one has one message which is different.
Yeah.
And then you can see.
Let me be even more specific. So on of length, say this is of length n. So I say m 0, 0 is 0, 1 is 0 to the n. M 0, 1 is also 0 to the n. M 1, 0 is 0 to the n. M 1, 1 is 1 to the n. Okay. Upon receiving C, which is C, anyway, I should have done this differently. 1, 2, just to make the notation consistent. C1, C2. If C1 is equal to C2, output 0 or otherwise output 1. Right? If the 2 ciphertexts are the same, I must have used this one. If the 2 ciphertexts are different, it must have been this one. Right? So, this wins the game with advantage 1/2, or it wins it with probability. Its success probability is 1/2, so its advantage is 1/2. It wins the probability is 1 of winning. Its advantage is 1/2. Sorry. Okay. So, indistinguishable encryptions is not good enough. It doesn't really give us something that we should use for this reason. After the break, I will tell you there are other reasons also why it's not sufficient. And the way we modify it actually solves both problems. We get 2 things in one shot. Okay, good. Then we do a break for, let's do 15 minutes. We meet again at 9:50 here in this room. Okay, good. Thanks. See you then in 50 minutes. How to construct it using pseudo-random generators, but we also saw that it doesn't have some properties that we needed usually, namely security or eavesdropping, indistinguishable encryptions, indistinguishable multiple encryptions. But it also is not sufficient in other aspects. And those are the ones that I first want to discuss, and then we'll see that they are related to this multiple encryption business as well. So far, we looked only at eavesdropping. We looked at it in eavesdropping and perfect secrecy, indistinguishable encryptions, and also multiple indistinguishable encryptions. And eavesdropping attacks, well, it doesn't give you guarantees for multiple encryptions, and it does not cover many practical attacks. And that is even true for a long time. Namely, already during the Second World War, much stronger attacks than just eavesdropping was used. Namely, the so-called gardening attacks that were used by the US and British intelligence service against the German Enigma encryption scheme. Gardening, so in the Enigma encryption scheme, actually was a machine that they used. Depending on which part of the Navy or intelligence service you were talking about in the German Reich, they used a different key every day. That was in particular true for the submarine communication. They used a new key every day that was collected in huge books where you say, okay, now for every day a new key. So it was important for the intelligence service of the Allies to recover that secret key for that particular case soon. They used various methods to do that. And you all know probably that Alan Turing was very important in Bletchley Park. To do that, they built sort of the first special purpose computers, the so-called bombs, huge machines that were larger than current supercomputers, but weren't able to do all that much. But even that would not have been sufficient to actually break or recover the key every day. Because the key space was simply too large. Even with the sophisticated methods they had and the reductions they used, the key space often was too large to recover the key fast. So what they did was, and the Germans were stupid enough to play an important part in that. So sometimes they knew that the submarines would send certain messages at certain times of the day containing certain words. For example, wetter. The weather reports, they were encrypted for some stupid reason. But given that you already knew, look, this message here is probably the encryption of the weather report. So you know that it they knew that it began with a certain string of words. And knowing that it began with a certain string of words and seeing the ciphertext, they were able to reduce again the space of possible keys further, because the key had to match the prefix of that message. Even that was not good enough. They sometimes wanted to have more messages that they knew contained certain words or certain sequences of words. And what they often did is they would bomb certain parts, typically naval bases on the North German coast, knowing that bombing then was obviously useful for them, but the more important part is they knew, because they were bombing the submarine naval bases, that the Germans would send out messages with exactly that information to the submarines. So they knew other messages, or they had other messages for which they knew there are certain words in there probably appearing. Wilhelmshaven, one of the important, or Kiel, whatever, one of the important naval bases for the German submarines. And so this technique, this method of inducing the Germans to send messages that they knew contained certain words was called gardening by the British and US intelligence services. Today, we unfortunately no longer call these attacks gardening attacks. We call them chosen plaintext attacks. But the type of method that you can use as an attacker is still valid and still used today. And it's even simpler, because many aspects of messages that are today sent around because you use certain protocols, you know that what the certain parts are. And you can also, in e-business or whatever, you can just induce the other side to send you certain messages, and those are encrypted. You know what they are. Okay? You probably don't. So now we want to be able to model those kinds of attacks. Okay? And we want to model them in such a way that it applies to all kinds of attacks of this type. So do it not application dependent, because then you would say, look, if you use my encryption scheme in that way, please add that modification to the encryption scheme. Otherwise, in your application, it's no longer secure. That will not work because people will not do that. Right? Typically, you need one-shot encryption schemes. They are good enough for all kinds of applications. And so you want to model these things not based on, okay, you can send this type of message or that type of message, or you can induce them to encrypt these words or those words. You want something that covers all of it and is very strong. Okay? And this is done by the enhancement to eavesdropping attacks that we consider next, namely these chosen plaintext attacks. This is still not our final security model. This will be even stronger and also practical. But that was discovered sort of later, although the notion was introduced before that, but that it's really practical, that was kind of proof of concept was done somewhat later. Okay, so these are chosen plaintext attacks or gardening attacks. As I said before the break, we keep the indistinguishability concept. That is always the same. So this modeling, the adversary chooses two messages, has to get the encryption of a random one of the two, has to decide which one. That we keep, but we give him more power. The adversary is not just able to listen or get this ciphertext, but he gets more power. Not computational power, but more information power. Right? He gets more information. Okay, and the way we do that is obviously by enhancing our indistinguishability game to the chosen plaintext indistinguishability game. It has the same outline as before. We have a challenger, and we look at arbitrary PPT adversaries, but we fix it for the definition. First, we fix the challenger. This is always the same, and then we fix an adversary. Okay, and here it comes. So the common input is 1 to the n, the security parameter. That determines again that C chooses the key using the key generation algorithm of the encryption scheme under consideration. Picking it usually uniformly at random. Then, and now comes the modification, A asks C for encryption of adaptively chosen plaintext P1, P2, and so on. So it can ask the adversary. The adversary does not know the key. So he cannot even compute encryptions itself. But here I say, look, adversary, challenger, I would like to see the encryption of this cipher, of this plaintext, an encryption of this plaintext, an encryption of this plaintext, and so on. And I say adaptively chosen. By that I mean he can ask for the encryption of the first plaintext. He sees the ciphertext. Then, depending on what the adversary has seen, he can pick the next plaintext. Then he sees an encryption of the second plaintext. Based on the encryption that he sees and the previous encryption that he saw, he can now pick the third plaintext for which he wants to see an encryption. Okay, that's adaptive. So depending on the answers that he saw before, he can choose the next plaintext for which he wants to see an encryption. But it's still going to be a PPT algorithm at the end, so computing the next plaintext for which he wants to see an encryption must be done in polynomial time. And he can only ask for polynomially many encryptions, because otherwise he needs more than polynomial time. Okay? So he gets all these things. And then, based on what he saw so far, he picks two messages M0, again, of the same length. So this is our usual stuff with the indistinguishability. B chooses B uniformly at random, computes C as the encryption of MB, and sends C to A. Now, based on the ciphertext C that A gets from C, he can ask for more encryptions of plaintext of his choice. Okay? And eventually he outputs a bit B prime. And he wins. And the result of the game is 1 if and only if B is equal to B prime. Okay? So the additional power that we give the adversary is here and here. In both cases, we can ask for encryptions. Okay. So what does we mean when A asks for the encryption of plaintext P? C answers with NK of P, where key is the key chosen in the first step of the game. Okay. The challenger simply runs the encryption algorithm with this key K, the one that was fixed in the first step. And again, as I said, adaptively, so the ith query may depend on the first queries and the answers that he received. So this is how we view this. This is the schematic view that we had for the eavesdropping. Now we have this. You get this in between. Here you get the PIs, you get the things back, and here you can ask for more things. Okay? And then, as we usually write now, we write this here, and now here is CPA, right? It's no longer eavesdropping, it's CPA. The rest is the same for the output of the game, and we call the chosen plaintext advantage, or the advantage against pi of A in the chosen plaintext game, as the probability that this is 1 minus 1/2, minus 1/2 as usual, absolute values as usual, and so on. And then we have our usual definition, namely private key encryption scheme pi has indistinguishable encryptions under chosen plaintext attacks, or is CPA secure if for every probabilistic polynomial time algorithm A, there exists a negligible function mu such that the CPA advantage of A against pi is bounded by mu, or is mu of n. Okay. Good. Yeah. Is CPA security achievable? I mean, why is it, okay? Let's do something else. Is a one-time pad CPA secure? Why not?
You can basically get the key, right?
Yes, yes, yeah, you can do that. Given this here, you know you get the encryption. Once you have the encryption, you XOR the ciphertext and the plaintext, you have the key. Another attack.
We could do a really simple attack and choose two messages, ask for encryptions of those two, and then use those as M0 and M1, and we already have, because we only have exactly one encryption.
Yeah.
Just look at what we are.
So I pick any two messages here. I get C, and then I ask for the encryption of the two messages and compare. Okay, so let's do this. Anyway, this is the, I'll go back to this. This is really CPA security and ECB mode that works. That's just what I already mentioned. Okay, so let's go to random functions as the first step in defining CPA secure encryption schemes. So let's fix some finite sets D and R. D stands for domain, R stands for range. And then I look at the set of all functions from D to R. And I call this func dr. All functions. Easy to see. The size of this set func dr is size of R to the size of D. Because for every element in D, you have that many possible images. And you can combine all these images in any way you like. That's why you multiply. Size of R, possible images for the first element in D, size of R, size of possible images for the second, and so on. Size of D often. So this is this set here. If an important case is when D and R are 0, 1 to the n. And in which case I call this func dr simply func n. If you look at it, this here, in this case, the size of func n is, well, it's 2 to the n, size of R, to the 2 to the n, size of D, which is 2 to the n times 2n. Yeah? Another way of viewing it is you look at this thing here, the exponent. To specify one function from this set, I have to tell you all possible images. Imagine that you have the images in 0, 1 to the n enumerated in one way, say lexicographically. Then to specify a function in here, I give you the image for the first element, n bits, right? Because it's a 0, 1 to the n bit string. Second image, n bits. Third image, n bits. Fourth image, n bits. So to specify a function, you need that many bits for each of the 2 to the n elements, n bits to specify its image. Since you can combine that in any way, and we are talking about bits, 2 to the n times 2 to the n. Okay? So the point is that I want to make here is even to specify a single function takes, in func n, takes exponentially many bits in n. Right? That many bits. Okay? So it doesn't really make sense if you have an algorithm that should run in time polynomial in n, you cannot give him this thing here. You cannot look at everything. Okay? Yeah? You should try it out. Try to write down all functions from 4 bits to 4 bits. You will have fun. Right? It's not a small number. Right? 2 to the 4 to the 2 to the 4. 2 to the 4 is 16. 4 times 16 is 64. So you have to write down 2 to the 64 bits. You probably will not finish today doing that. Okay? So these sets easily become huge. And that they have this huge size will require us to use a certain way of defining things. Okay. And now we can say we call a function generated by picking one uniformly at random from the set is called a random function on n bits. Picking it cannot be done in polynomial time, in n, because it requires that many bits. And you cannot pick exponentially many bits in polynomial time. But there is, in some sense, another way of looking at a random function so that you can actually build them on the fly. Okay? By which I mean you want from Henrik a random function. Okay? And Henrik is not able to store these 2 to the 64 bits or so. Right? So, but what you can do is say, okay, look, please give me the image of the first of the following argument. So what Henrik can do is he has nothing stored. He just picks an n-bit string uniformly at random. That's the image. Then you want a second the image for a second argument. Send it to Henrik. He says, okay, I pick a next bit string uniformly at random. Give it that to you, and so on. So you can build that on the fly by if the need arises to get a new image for a new argument, pick an image uniformly at random. And that works. That is exactly what we do. Right? Because picking the whole function is, well, pick one for the first image uniformly at random. Independent, pick one for the second, independent for the third, and so on. If you want to have something like that, do it on the fly. Okay? More specifically, and this is actually what gives us also an idea of how to work with random functions, we have the following observation. Talking about the probability space of a random function. Picking a function uniformly at random from all possible functions from n bits to n bits. And this is the case where I restrict myself to. Okay? And here we have the first observation on random functions. And I will prove that in a quite detailed way. So let n and s be natural numbers. Then we have x1 through xs in 0, 1 to the n, pairwise different bit strings. So s should be less than 2 to the n, because otherwise it doesn't work. And let y1 through ys be arbitrary. They could even have repetitions. Then the probability over picking a function uniformly at random from func n that f of x1 is y1 and then so on. F of xs is equal to ys is 1 over 2 to the s times n, which is 1 over 2 to the n to the s. Right? It says, yeah, you pick them. You can just pick them uniformly at random independently. Right? This says, I will do that on the next lemma. Actually, this is really independence. Let's prove this. Okay. So, what is this probability over this choice of f? That f of x1 is y1 and so on, f of xs is equal to ys. I just write down what this probability means because I'm talking about uniform stuff. This is the number of functions f that have this property divided by the overall number of functions that I have. Right? So this is size of my space divided by the size of the set f such that f of x1 is equal to y1 and f of xs is equal to ys. Right? It's uniform. The good ones, the number of good ones divided by the overall number. Yeah. Okay, so this here we know this is 2 to the n times 2 to the n. What is this guy here? How many functions have that? Well, we can now go back to this way here. We fixed the images for S elements. But for the remaining ones, we can do whatever we like and can combine that in any way we like. Okay? So for the other elements, and there are 2 to the n minus S elements left, we have this here, right? Or other way around. So I can pick any of the possible images for the remaining elements, namely 2 to the n minus S many. Okay? Yeah. And then we are done, right? Because then this and this here cancels, and we are just left with this minus S here. So this is 1 over 2 to the n times S. We are done. And doing roughly this, but you see that they really need to be pairwise different, right? Because that comes in here that I say I subtract exactly S. For exactly S elements, I fixed the image already, and not fewer of them. So, in any case, if 2 of the xi's are the same, and then I would provide different y's for them, that is not a function. Doesn't work. So the lemma then says the important lemma is, and that justifies the way Henrik picked his choices or his on-the-fly values for the function, is let n be in n, let x1, xt be in 0, 1, n pairwise different, let y, y1, yt be arbitrary. Then the probability over choice of the function that f of x is equal to y, condition that you already fixed the other elements, is 1 over 2 to the n. It's the same as this thing here, which is also 1 over 2 to the n. Right? So the values, the images for a random function are picked independently. That's why Henrik was able to just, forget what I just told you, except if you ask him for the image for the same argument twice. Then he should remember, you already asked that. I give you back the original value. But if you get a new one, well, he picks independently a new one. Okay. The way you do that is, I'll do that again formally, just to make sure that you understand what a random function is. Okay, and that's probably the last thing that I do. Today. So proof what is this conditional probability? Well, by simply the definition of conditional probability, this is the probability of f of x is y and f of x1 is y1 and f of xt is yt divided by the probability of f of x1 is equal to y1 and so on. F of xt is equal to yt. Yep. From our observation here, we know that in this case we have t plus 1 of those things. So this is 1 over n times t plus 1 times n divided by 1 over 2 to the, here we have only t of these, t times n. Yeah. And now we are done. Yeah. This is 1 over 2 to the n. We are done. Okay. But this is how you can imagine, and it's often useful to imagine such a thing. And actually, random function, pick the images independently. Make sure that it's a function. Everything else doesn't matter. Yeah? Okay. Good. So that's, I think we stop here for today. This year, it's a huge number. Okay. Okay. So what should you take away from today? Remember pseudo-randomness as an important ingredient to construct cryptographic schemes. Security proof, you prove something is secure if you use true randomness, uniform randomness, and then you can replace it by pseudo-randomness. Okay. And then we looked at this more important, this new concept of chosen plaintext attacks. And remember, this requires probabilistic stuff. It's practical, and to achieve that, you cannot use deterministic encryption schemes. You need to have probabilistic encryption schemes. You need to make sure that you will never see the same encryption of a message twice. And that's why at some point I flipped from I give you this ciphertext of a message to S ciphertext of a message, because that's important. That's exactly the point where I flip from deterministic to probabilistic, and from one-time pad also to new schemes. And then this year we'll talk about, next time we have to replace these truly random functions by pseudo-random functions, and that, as we will see, gives us CPA secure encryption schemes. Okay, that will be done next week. That's it for today. Thank you.